One book held the answer until it vanished in the shadows. Welcome to Midnight Radio Drama. I am your host, Wilfred. Your voices bring this channel to life. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I can't wait to read your words. Let's uncover the case. The people of Flaxborough had long prided themselves on the town's reputation for solemn probity. There was very little in the way of violent crime, and the occasional arrest for disorder usually concerned a visiting commercial traveller who had mistaken the snug of the railway arms for the lounge bar of the Savoy. Yet on the morning that Mr. Alderman Clegg presided over the monthly magistrates' court, a faint tremor ran through the civic bosom, for the principal exhibit in a pending trial, a thick, brass-clasped Bible belonging to the Wesleyan chapel, had disappeared overnight from the custody of the police. It was Mr. Cranch, the town clerk, who first spoke of it, his voice carrying like a sermon across the courtroom before the hearing had properly begun. "Really," he said, in the deliberate manner of one rehearsed in both law and propriety, "this is most irregular. If sacred objects are not safe within the evidence store, one wonders what next may vanish, the mace, perhaps." The bench stirred in mild alarm. Alderman Clegg, rotund and perpetually flushed, as though court business were an extension of Sunday dinner, peered over his spectacles at the assembled parties. "The Bible was central to the matter before us, was it not?" he asked, directing his words towards the prosecuting solicitor. "Indeed," came the reply, though it sounded more like reluctant confession than affirmation. At the back of the room, several ladies from the chapel auxiliary whispered with the contained satisfaction of those who had always thought something shady would come of involving the law in chapel affairs. One of them, Mrs. Fordle, a woman of considerable bosom and negligible discretion, declared in a stage whisper that this was the sort of thing one might expect when Methodists resorted to secular justice. Her neighbour hushed her, not out of theological disagreement, but because she wished to hear every detail herself. The accused man, a lean, ferrety fellow named Goffin, stood in the dock with an expression oscillating between bewilderment and sly relief. He had been charged with attempting to sell the chapel Bible to a collector of ecclesiastical curiosities from Birmingham. The collector had been quite candid in his statement. He had not doubted the book's authenticity in the least, but merely haggled over the price on grounds of its being slightly water-stained. Now, with the incriminating object gone, Goffin permitted himself a look that hovered on the edge of insolence. The magistrates, unused to prisoners appearing anything but abashed, regarded him with distaste. It was at this moment Inspector Purbright entered the court. He came without haste, his manner as calm as though he had merely stepped in to borrow a pen. To those who knew him, however, the slight narrowing of his eyes as he surveyed the assembly suggested that a certain portion of quiet thought had already been expended on the business. Purbright inclined his head to the bench. "I beg your pardon, sir. There has been an inconvenience." The court leaned forward. That word, from the inspector, encompassed everything from a misplaced umbrella to the discovery of a skeleton in a well. "The Bible," said Alderman Clegg, attempting gravity but achieving only peevishness, "has, we understand, been mislaid." Purbright folded his hands. "It would appear so. The matter is being looked into." The defence solicitor, a man of such youthful aspect that one suspected he had been delivered straight from a university debating society, leapt eagerly to his feet. "In that case, sir, I submit that there can be no further proceedings against my client, there being no material evidence to put before the court." There was a rustle of approval among the back benches. The chapel ladies leaned together in delight. Goffin attempted to look modest, but his thin lips curved in a way that suggested he was mentally calculating his prospects of celebratory ale. The alderman, after a struggle, announced an adjournment. "This court," he declared, cannot be expected to continue without the principal exhibit. We must hope that Inspector Purbright and his colleagues can resolve the mystery with all due expedition. Outside, the town absorbed the news with the speed and relish of a sponge cake encountering sherry. By luncheon, it was known in every draper's, tea shop and tobacconist's that the police had somehow contrived to lose the word of God. Interpretations varied. Some suggested that Goffin had accomplices of such cunning that the prison lockup itself could not deter them. Others maintained that the constabulary had deliberately mislaid the evidence in order to spare the town the shame of prosecuting a man over a Bible. A few whispered, with the relish of the scandal-hungry, that the book had not been stolen at all but quietly borrowed by some member of the police who considered his own domestic devotions undersupplied. In the snug of the Feathers Hotel, Mr. Gordon Perks, insurance agent and indefatigable theorist of local affairs, declared it to be a case of professional jealousy between the Methodists and the Anglicans. "Mark my words," he said, to the general nodding of those around him, "the vicarage will be found knee-deep in Bibles before the week is out." Meanwhile, Purbright returned to the station, where Sergeant Love sat gloomily at his desk, surrounded by ledgers. Love, broad, slow, and given to an almost devotional loyalty to paperwork, looked up in melancholy apology. "I checked the evidence cupboard twice, sir. Padlock was untouched, no sign of forced entry, and yet—" He gestured vaguely, as though the absence of a heavy Bible might be illustrated by a wave of the hand. Purbright regarded him kindly. "You are certain it was there last night? Certain as I am that this is Wednesday?" Purbright's eyes twinkled almost imperceptibly. "And you are equally certain of that?" Love, after a moment's reflection, said, "Fairly, sir." The inspector left him to his ledgers and went quietly into his office, where he sat by the window and observed the comings and goings of the High Street. His gaze was not unkind, but it was unyielding. Flaxborough had, it seemed, embarked upon one of its curious little dramas, and it would not do to hurry the opening act. People revealed more, he knew, in their bustling to assign blame than in the act of wrongdoing itself. For the moment, he allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Somewhere between the chapel pews, the court benches, and the gossiping counters of the town's shops, the vanished Bible had already begun its second life. Whether that life would prove more edifying than its first remained, of course, to be discovered. The disappearance of the Bible was, by the next morning, no longer a curious footnote in the business of the magistrate's court, but a firm topic of gossip at the butcher's, the baker's, and even the drearier establishments where tea was sold with a modest allowance of conversation. Mrs. Withers at the newsagent's had already declared with her habitual conviction that calamity was invariably clerical, that the book had been mislaid by the ushers, as are most things of consequence in that building. Her opinion gained the kind of immediate acceptance that required no evidence, being pronounced in the confident manner of someone for whom facts were merely a social discourtesy. Meanwhile, in the snug bar of the Crown and Cushion, two gentlemen of retirement and comfortable waistlines entertained themselves with darker conjecture. "It'll be the defence what pinched it," said Mr. Follard, late of the Rural District Council. "On account of it being one of them temperance Bibles, can't have a chap swearing by anything so repressive, not when he's accused of brawling in a public house." His companion, Mr. Crimp, preferred to believe that the missing book was a prank by schoolboys. Both theories enjoyed a brief life before being abandoned in favour of a more promising one about Freemasons. Inspector Purbright, arriving at the police station with his usual unhurried gait, found his sergeant already besieged by a file of notes, reports, and telephone messages. Love, a man who treated every scrap of communication as though it might conceal an outrage against the empire itself, handed over the top sheet with the faint sigh of one who expected it to be ignored. "Clerk of the court insists, sir, that the Bible was last seen yesterday morning, placed on the shelf as usual. Usher says he fetched it when the accused was to be sworn, but it was gone. He swears it's the only thing he has ever known to vanish in that building without being signed for." Purbright folded the paper and put it in his inside pocket without reading. "I imagine," he remarked pleasantly, "that the usher has lived a comparatively sheltered life." Love, who rarely understood when he was being amused at, straightened his tie and added, "There is a suggestion, sir, from the chairman of the bench, that this is a matter requiring discreet police inquiry." "Ah," Purbright replied. "Discreet inquiries. I find those are rather like discreet coughs. Everyone notices them but chooses not to remark." Nonetheless, before the day had properly advanced into its dull rhythm, Purbright made his way to the magistrate's court, that modest brick edifice whose sense of self-importance derived less from its architecture than from the fact it had endured half a century without a repaint. The usher, a Mr. Crottle, received him with the air of a man too long acquainted with the indignities of public service. He was adamant that the Bible had been in its usual place when he dusted the benches. His description of the missing volume was detailed to the point of devotion, a stout, leather-bound copy with corners softened by a century of oaths, its gilt lettering worn but not effaced. "It fair gives you confidence, sir, in the majesty of the law when you hold it out," Crottle explained, as if its moral influence might have been the greater part of justice's armoury. Purbright, with his patient expression, inquired after those who might have had access to the courtroom. Crottle's list was impressive in its length and entirely unhelpful in its inclusiveness: clerks, cleaners, constables, prisoners, counsel, caretakers, counsellors, and the occasional pigeon. "It might have been anyone, sir," he concluded. Purbright agreed gently that this seemed likely. He left the usher's office with no more than a faint curiosity about the precision of Crottle's dusting habits, and paused instead in the corridor, where he found Mrs. Winch, the cleaning woman, setting down her pail. She was a small, wiry figure whose opinions generally arrived before her person, and she was prepared with one now. "Gone, is it? Well, I'm not surprised. Things don't stick here, not since they started bringing in them outside contractors for the windows. First, it'll be the Bible. Next, it'll be the court safe. Mark my words, Inspector." The inspector did not mark her words, but he listened to them with the same courtesy he might have offered the Lord Chancellor. The afternoon saw him making a less formal call upon the Reverend Feathers, vicar of St. Swithin's, whose proximity to both divine and civic matters had given him a voice of authority beyond his pulpit. The Reverend received him in a drawing-room that smelt agreeably of both furniture polish and pipe smoke, and heard the matter of the missing Bible with a sorrowful gravity. "Distressing, Inspector, most distressing. I cannot but feel it symbolic. A society that allows its sacred text to disappear is one already half adrift." "I suppose," Purbright said mildly, "we must be grateful it was not the court's supply of blotting paper. The symbolic implications would be less majestic." The Reverend, after blinking once, agreed this was true. He went on to confide that he had once lent a Bible to the churchwarden's nephew, and not seen it again for 2 years, which might suggest that vanishing Bibles were a more common occurrence than generally supposed. Purbright thanked him and rose to go, leaving behind an impression that he valued the confidence far more than he did. By evening, the tale had lengthened in its retelling until it became, in some quarters, a rumour of burglary. The Crown and Cushion repeated it with embellishments involving burglary tools, disguises, and a band of itinerant Methodists. At the post office counter, the theory ran towards sabotage by anti-clerical radicals. Through all this, Purbright's mind returned to the curious solemnity with which the usher had described the missing Bible. To Crottle it had been more than an object. It was a piece of ceremony, a safeguard of continuity. If someone had taken it, they had done so not out of opportunity alone, but with some sense of what it represented. That, in the inspector's experience, was the sort of motive one could not easily explain by mischief alone. When he returned to his office that night, Sergeant Love was waiting with a report. "Sir, there's another detail. Clark says one of the defense witnesses was seen loitering in the corridor. A man named Blee, small tradesman, second-hand furniture mostly, known to buy anything cheap." "Furniture," Purbright repeated softly, "and perhaps Bibles." He looked, for a moment, entirely thoughtful. Then, smoothing his papers into a neat pile, he gave no further opinion and sent Love home with the gentle instruction to lock the station door carefully. The inspector remained at his desk for some while, reflecting upon the ways in which people handled objects that were at once practical and symbolic. A man might steal a chair to sit upon, but a Bible was another matter. Here, he thought, was a theft, not of use, but of meaning. And in that lay the shape of the first real clue. It was the following morning when Inspector Purbright directed his steps toward the High Street, where Mr. Blee's emporium presented itself to the world as though it had been assembled from the cast-offs of half a century. The windows were crowded with an unconvincing display of brass fenders, bent umbrellas, and the kind of china dogs whose eyes had watched generations of parlor carpets discolor. A hand-painted sign announced "Furniture, Curios, and Sundries, reasonable terms." Reasonableness, Purbright suspected, would not be the strongest feature of Mr. Blee's business. Inside, the air was faint, with old varnish, and less faint with cabbage soup. It was a cave of mismatched chairs, sideboards stacked upon tables, and framed pictures leaning against one another in precarious alliances. The proprietor himself emerged from behind a wardrobe with the wary shuffle of a man who expected complaints as part of the day's custom. "Morning, Mr. Blee," Purbright began, his tone conveying politeness, edged with something firmer. "I'm told you were seen in the court corridors yesterday. I thought I'd ask what took you there." Blee, a wiry man whose clothes appeared to have been cut for someone both taller and wealthier, glanced about as though the furniture might supply him with an excuse. "Well, Inspector, I had business with a client. Man owed me on a sideboard. Said he'd be at court, so I waited. Nothing irregular in that, surely?" "Not irregular, no," Purbright agreed pleasantly. "Though unusual. Most clients prefer to settle debts somewhere other than a corridor leading to the magistrate's chamber." The trader's thin smile betrayed unease. He ran his finger along the rim of a china teacup. "Well, you know how it is. If you don't take your chance to press a man, you might never see him again. I've had worse meetings in worse places." Purbright allowed the silence to linger before asking, "Did you, by chance, see anything untoward while you waited? Perhaps a book being carried away?" Blee's head jerked up at that, then lowered quickly as though the dust on the floorboards had suddenly become fascinating. "Book, sir? Can't say I did. Not the sort of thing I'd notice. A book's a book." "Not always," Purbright said quietly. "Some books carry weight out of proportion to their pages." The remark seemed to disturb Blee. His shoulders twitched and he turned toward the clutter of chairs, pretending to rearrange them. "I wouldn't know about that, Inspector. My trade's in things you can sit on, not things you can read." Satisfied that further pressure would merely drive the man into stubborn denial, Purbright thanked him with exaggerated courtesy and withdrew, though he left behind the faint impression that he might return without warning. Back at the station he found Sergeant Love bent over a ledger with the intensity of one deciphering an enemy code. Love looked up with relief at his superior's arrival. "Sir, I've been going through reports. There's something odd. Apparently, a local chapel had its lectern Bible disappear about a fortnight ago. Minister assumed it was a borrowing mistake, but the description is remarkably similar to the one missing from the court. Purbright sat down, hands folded, his expression betraying no more than mild interest, though his mind immediately began to draw threads between the two incidents. 2 missing Bibles, one from a court of law, the other from a place of worship. The coincidence is almost too generous. Did the minister report any suspects? None, sir. He said they'd lately had a visit from an itinerant preacher. Fellow stirred things up, gave a talk about renewal of faith, then vanished. The minister seemed half inclined to think him responsible. Vanished, Purbright repeated softly. They often do. The inspector let the words hang, then rose to consult the maps kept in the station's dusty cupboard. He traced a finger from the chapel to the court, then further afield to St. Swithin's, where the Reverend Feathers had, only yesterday, spoken with such solemnity about the symbolic significance of missing Bibles. A pattern, however faint, seemed to be drawing itself. Not burglary, not mischief, but purpose, yet purpose of a kind not yet legible. In the afternoon, Purbright attended a small gathering at the Crown and Cushion, where, by means of appearing no more curious than a neighbour, he allowed himself to overhear. It did not take long before the locals, whose appetite for narrative was as robust as their thirst, embroidered the story further. A missing Bible became several missing Bibles, theft became conspiracy, and before the evening drew to a close, the entire affair was attributed to a secret society bent on undermining the justice system. Returning to the police station, Purbright found Love still at work, the sergeant's natural diligence serving as a useful counterbalance to the inspector's measured patience. "I've made a list of all the public buildings in town that keep Bibles for oath-taking or display," Love announced. "Would you like me to make inquiries?" "Yes, but discreetly," Purbright replied, "and perhaps with the appearance of idle conversation rather than official questioning. We don't want the entire borough convinced that the Holy Writ is in more danger than the crown jewels." Love, proud of this delicate assignment, left with alacrity, while Purbright remained at his desk, his thoughts circling. Why would anyone, or any group, remove Bibles from places that embodied authority? One from a church, one from a court. He recalled Crottle's near reverence for the book as a ceremonial object. These thefts, or appropriations, were not about Scripture as reading matter, but as symbol. Someone was collecting the tokens of authority itself. By the end of the week, Love returned with further intelligence. "Sir, the school's Bible is still in its place, and so is the one at the library. But the infirmary's copy has gone missing. The matron says she noticed it yesterday. She thought it had been lent to a patient, but none admits to borrowing it." 3. Purbright now counted 3 vanishings, a pattern no longer faint but undeniable. A thief of Bibles, yet not for profit, nor for private piety, unless the latter could be so insatiable. He walked that evening along the riverbank, where the august light softened the outlines of warehouses and the distant hum of motor traffic carried faintly on the air. His mind kept circling back to the same conclusion. These disappearances were not random. Someone was engaged in an enterprise whose meaning was, for the moment, locked away. But he felt certain that meaning was not trivial. The inspector paused beneath the railway bridge, watching the slow drift of water, and thought of Blee again. The tradesman had been too quick to dismiss books as beneath his notice, and yet, Purbright reflected, second-hand dealers often understood very well the peculiar market value of objects others overlooked. If Blee had seen a profit in sacred tomes, he might attempt to disguise his knowledge. And yet profit did not satisfy. Bibles taken from a chapel, a court, an infirmary, each place a pillar of communal life, each bound by ceremony. This was not commerce. It was something else, something that might, in time, touch every institution in Fenchester. Purbright, turning back towards the station, resolved to proceed with patience. The thief, whoever he was, had begun a game that could not be concluded in secrecy forever. Every theft enlarged the circle of consequence, and when at last the purpose emerged, it would do so with all the clarity of daylight, however much shadow it had been nurtured in. It was with deliberate calm that Inspector Purbright entered the vestry of St. Swithin's the following morning. Reverend Feathers, a man whose angular frame seemed designed to fit the narrow panels of ecclesiastical architecture, looked up from his desk with a mixture of relief and mild apprehension. Relief, because the inspector's presence suggested that the matter of the missing Bible was being taken seriously. Apprehension, because the same presence might mean unwelcome revelations about the parish. "You've come, Inspector. I was beginning to think the police considered it beneath their dignity to investigate thefts of the sacred word," Feathers remarked, his voice pitched somewhere between indignation and appeal. Purbright accepted a hard chair opposite him. "On the contrary, Reverend, we take seriously any removal of property, particularly when it represents more than its material value. You are not, I understand, the only sufferer." The clergyman's brows rose in astonishment. "You mean others? Other institutions?" "Quite so. The infirmary has reported a disappearance, and before that, a chapel on the west side, which suggests that your loss is part of something larger." Reverend Feathers exhaled, as though the inspector's words confirmed some privately nurtured anxiety. "I feared as much. There's an unpleasant rumour circulating among my parishioners that some sect has set its face against the town. They talk of judgments and signs, though no one can say whose judgments or what signs." Purbright, who had often found that parish gossip revealed more in its embroidery than its fabric, merely nodded. "I should like to see the lectern from which your Bible was taken." The vestry led directly into the church, where morning light strained through pale glass gave the interior a wan solemnity. The brass lectern stood at the chancel steps, its eagle's outstretched wings empty. Dust had gathered on the velvet cushion, save for the rectangle where the book had once lain. "Nothing else disturbed?" Purbright asked. "Nothing," said Feathers. "The organist, who has a nose for trifles, insisted the cushions on the choir stalls had been turned over, but I cannot see how that bears upon the theft." "Perhaps it doesn't," Purbright murmured, though his eyes lingered thoughtfully. A thief who disturbed nothing else was either very disciplined or very reverent. Neither explanation sat comfortably. On leaving the church, he encountered Sergeant Love waiting dutifully in the lane. The young man, whose sense of timing was rarely more than a minute off Purbright's, reported briskly. "Sir, I've been asking among the booksellers. No one has had any Bibles offered for sale, though one fellow did say he'd seen Mr. Blee inquiring about old religious tracts. Didn't buy any, but asked their dates and publishers." "Curious," Purbright said. "Mr. Blee claims to have no interest in reading matter, yet here he is measuring the antiquity of tracts. One begins to suspect he knows more of paper than of pine wardrobes." Love beamed at the inspector's recognition of his detective effort. "Shall I watch his shop?" "Not overtly. Mr. Blee is the sort to mistake observation for persecution. Better that we let him grow confident. A man who thinks he has eluded notice often betrays himself more swiftly than one who feels hunted." They walked together toward the market square, where the day's bustle carried on without knowledge of vanishing scriptures. Yet Purbright could not help but feel that the absence of those volumes was exerting a pressure upon the town, invisible but undeniable, as though each theft hollowed out a small cavity in its collective confidence. That evening he sat in his office, reading through the notes Love had compiled. The names of the missing Bible's custodians formed a neat column: chapel minister, Reverend Feathers, hospital matron. The list had the effect of a catalogue of institutions: faith, law, healing, all the pillars that gave structure to community life. The thief, whoever he was not random in his choices. He was removing the symbolic foundations one by one. It was close upon 9 o'clock when Constable Garrity tapped on the door and presented himself with the awkward solemnity of a messenger who feels his news is larger than he is. "Beg pardon, sir, but there's been a bit of trouble at the town hall. The clerk says their Bible is gone too. Discovered it this evening when setting out the things for tomorrow's session." Purbright set down his pen slowly. 4. Another piece removed from the architecture of order. He dismissed Garrity with a brief instruction to obtain a written statement from the clerk, and then sat in the quiet office, hands steepled. Whoever was behind this enterprise, the intention had become bolder. It was no longer confined to semi-private institutions. Now the very seat of civic administration had been touched. The following morning he called upon the town hall himself. The clerk, a harassed man with the air of one who blamed himself for the failings of the entire borough, insisted no door had been forced. "Everything was locked, sir, I'm certain of it. The keys never leave my pocket." "Then someone possessed another key," Purbright suggested. The clerk shuddered. "That would mean inside help." "Not necessarily. Locks are often more symbolic than secure," Purbright said dryly, though he noted the man's agitation with care. An overburdened conscience could sometimes reveal more than deliberate confession. When he returned to the station, he found Sergeant Love waiting, his expression clouded by excitement and a trace of alarm. "Sir, I think I've found a connection. There's a small society, the Fellowship of the Eternal Word, they call themselves. Not registered as anything official, but they meet in hired rooms above a chemist's shop. Their pamphlets go on about restoring reverence to institutions." Purbright looked at him steadily. "And you think they are behind this?" Love hesitated. "It would fit, wouldn't it? They talk about symbols being misused, oaths treated lightly. If they thought to make a point, perhaps they'd gather the Bibles themselves." The inspector rose and moved to the window, where the square outside bustled with innocent ordinariness. "It might fit, love, but I have learned that things which fit too neatly at the start often prove to be the wrong pattern altogether. Still, we should not disregard them. Make quiet inquiries, discreet, remember. A fellowship that proclaims reverence may also proclaim persecution if it suits their cause." By afternoon, whispers were already moving faster than the police could. Shopkeepers were remarking that if the police could not guard God's own book, what chance had they of guarding anything else? In taverns, the more bibulous speculated on divine displeasure. Others blamed pranksters or foreigners or both. Purbright, observing this gentle ferment, recognized the thief's success. The thefts had already become more powerful in rumor than in fact. The town was beginning to sense not the absence of books, but the presence of a design. That night, alone in his study, Purbright laid out the reports before him. 4 missing volumes, each removed from a different sphere of civic authority. He traced the list with his finger: church, chapel, infirmary, town hall. The courts had gone earlier still. Each theft had been executed without force, without disturbance, without clue, save for the lingering impression of purpose. The inspector leaned back, his eyes half closed. There was a thief abroad who collected not objects, but meanings. And somewhere, perhaps in a cluttered back room above a chemist's shop, or in the dusty recesses of Blee's furniture warehouse, or in some yet unconsidered hiding place, those books were gathered together. Their presence, concentrated, might be intended to lend weight to a gesture yet to come. What gesture? That, Purbright thought with grim patience, was the puzzle. He knew only that when it came, the town would not mistake it for chance. Inspector Purbright awoke the next morning with the curious sense that the town itself was leaning forward, waiting. It was a familiar sensation, one he had felt during earlier investigations, moments when a community, unsettled but uncertain of the source of its unease, began to hold its breath. He took his tea without haste, for he had long ago learned that an investigation's rhythm could not be accelerated by mere eagerness. Yet he left his lodgings earlier than usual, coat-buttoned, hat brim low, as though acknowledging that the day might offer a development not to be missed. At the station, Sergeant Love was already immersed in a small heap of pamphlets and clippings. He looked up with a face flushed from effort. "Sir, I've been tracing this Fellowship of the Eternal Word. They've taken rooms above Bellamy's chemist shop for the past 6 months. Membership seems to be no more than a dozen or so, though they advertise themselves as a movement." He paused, tapping a pamphlet. "They talk about cleansing institutions, about restoring solemnity where it's been lost. It's all rather vague, but I can't help noticing that their language about taking back the sacred sounds, well, sir, not unlike what's been happening." Purbright settled himself, scanning one of the leaflets. The print was uneven, clearly from a small hand press. Words like defilement, empty rituals, and symbols reclaimed appeared with unsettling frequency. "It is often the vague statements," he remarked, "that conceal the sharpest intentions. Did you speak with Bellamy?" "Briefly, sir. He says they are quiet enough, pay their rent regularly, and keep odd hours. He's never had trouble with them, but he thinks them peculiar. One of them, a tall fellow with spectacles, was always inquiring about ink and sealing wax, as though he meant to bind books rather than read them." Purbright nodded slowly, then turned his gaze toward the square outside. "If they are behind these disappearances, they have either hidden the Bibles or intend to display them. In either case, secrecy cannot serve them forever." He paused. "We shall pay a call upon this fellowship. Not a raid, mind you, merely a visit. We must learn whether their piety includes light fingers." That afternoon, under a drizzle that blurred the shop signs into smudges of colour, Purbright and Love made their way to Bellamy's chemist. The stairway beside the shop was narrow and unlit, smelling faintly of iodine and damp plaster. At the top, a door bore a pasted notice: "The Fellowship of the Eternal Word, meeting here. Thursdays, 8 p.m. They knocked, and after a moment the door opened to reveal a man whose build suggested both stoicism and stubbornness. His hair, once dark, had thinned to a halo, and his spectacles magnified eyes that held both suspicion and weariness. "Yes?" he asked, in a voice that managed courtesy only by formality. "Inspector Purbright, Flaxborough Police," said Purbright with mild gravity. "We would be grateful for a few words." The man stepped aside reluctantly. The room beyond was bare, except for a table, a dozen mismatched chairs, and a cupboard. A faint odour of ink and glue lingered. On the table lay several sheets of paper crowded with scripture verses in uneven type. The man introduced himself as Mr. Gorse, Secretary of the Fellowship. "Our purpose," he declared, standing stiffly, "is to recall men and women to reverence, not to amuse, not to entertain, but to remind. We do not seek publicity." Purbright regarded him with unhurried patience. "A commendable aim, Mr. Gorse, though I wonder whether any of your members have sought to remind institutions rather forcibly by removing their Bibles." Gorse stiffened. "We are not thieves. If a Bible is missing from its proper place, that is the fault of those entrusted with it. We cannot be held responsible for other men's neglect." Sergeant Love, less skilled at restraining incredulity, glanced sharply at Purbright, but the inspector merely inclined his head. "Indeed. Still, symbols contempt. I should like to know where you obtain the volumes you use for your gatherings." Gorse hesitated fractionally before replying, "Our members bring their own. Some are inherited, some purchased." His voice regained firmness. "We would not touch what belongs to others. That would be hypocrisy." Purbright allowed the words to stand, but he noted the hesitation. He cast his eyes about the room, lingering on the cupboard. "Might I?" he asked, gesturing. Gorse moved swiftly, almost too swiftly, to open it. Inside were stacks of folded pamphlets, bottles of ink, sealing wax, a small press, nothing resembling a Bible. "You see?" Gorse said too quickly. Purbright closed the cupboard gently. "Yes, I see." He left with a courteous nod, Love following, frowning with frustration. Once outside in the drizzle, Love burst out, "He's hiding something, sir." "I'm sure of it." "Quite likely," Purbright agreed calmly. "But the something may not be what we assume. A cupboard can be filled with many kinds of secrets. Our task is not to force open the first we see, but to determine which concealment matters." They returned to the station, and by evening, Purbright had another visitor, this time the matron of the infirmary. She came unannounced, her uniform starched to severity, her voice brisk with suppressed indignation. "Inspector, I cannot remain silent. The theft of our Bible was bad enough, but now a patient insists he saw it being carried out by a porter, one of our own staff." Purbright motioned her to sit. "Which porter, madam?" "Name of Pilbeam, a quiet fellow new to us, but he was seen with a large volume under his arm, leaving by the side door late in the evening. When challenged, he claimed it was his own book, but it was not. I know it was not." This was a development Purbright had not anticipated so soon. The careful pattern of thefts suggested a single hand, not ordinary pilfering, by hospital staff. Yet coincidence was rarely so obliging. He thanked the matron and promised to look into the matter. After she departed, he sat a long while, considering. If Pilbeam had indeed carried the book away, was he an opportunist or a messenger? Could the fellowship have agents placed where Bibles lay vulnerable? Or was Pilbeam acting under a different design altogether? When at last he spoke, it was to Sergeant Love, who hovered with undisguised eagerness. "Find this Pilbeam, quietly. Speak to him, but do not alarm him. I would know whether he is a fool, a zealot, or something in between." The night passed heavily over Flaxborough, its streets wet and reflective under the gas lamps. And somewhere within those shadows, Purbright felt certain, the missing Bibles rested together, waiting to be revealed. What disturbed him was not their concealment, but the sense that the thief, or thieves, had not yet completed their design. What had begun as a pattern of absence was building toward a presence, and when that presence declared itself, it would do so with purpose sharp enough to unsettle the whole town. Sergeant Love found Pilbeam that same evening in the porter's lodge of the infirmary. The man was hunched over a mug of tea, his face pale and tired, as though he had spent more hours carrying burdens than his back was built for. Love, careful not to alarm him, made light conversation about the weather, about the patients who always rang for assistance at inconvenient hours, about the difficulty of finding proper boots in Flaxborough. Only when the man's shoulders had dropped slightly did he ask, with studied casualness, "And I hear you're fond of books, Mr. Pilbeam. Not many porters lug their own volumes about." Pilbeam looked up sharply, his eyes darting. "Who said that?" "Nothing wrong with it," Love replied easily, though his heart quickened. Inspector Purbright himself is a man for reading, though he leans more on reports than sermons. Still, I was curious what sort of book a fellow like you carries around. Pilbeam licked his lips, set down his mug. "It's private. Nothing to do with the hospital." Love tilted his head. "Private? But mistaken for the hospital's own Bible? That's a misfortune, isn't it? You'll want to clear that up. The man's hands trembled faintly as he clasped them together. I've done nothing wrong. I had to move it. Someone asked me. Who? Love asked, his voice still mild, though he felt the words sharpen. Pilbeam hesitated, then shook his head. I can't say. They'll know I told. Love let the silence stretch. At last, Pilbeam muttered, It was for the fellowship. They said it belonged to them, that it had been neglected where it was. They told me to take it to them, said it was service to God. The sergeant's mind raced, but his voice remained calm. And where did you take it? To the room above the chemist. I left it there. They promised it would be looked after, used in worship. I thought it no harm. Love gave a small nod, suppressing his relief at the confession. All right, Pilbeam, no cause to fret, but you'll understand the inspector will want a word. When Love relayed this to Purbright later that night, the inspector's expression grew grave. So the fellowship have indeed acquired at least one Bible by means less than honest. That is sufficient to establish a pattern, but the greater question is why, if they merely wished a supply for their own devotions, there are simpler methods. They could purchase them by the dozen. Instead, they choose theft, targeted and deliberate. It suggests they want not just the book, but the place from which it came. He rose and paced slowly, hands behind his back. They are not merely collecting, they are displacing, removing the symbol from its appointed post, as if to show the institution itself unworthy. That is a more troubling ambition. The following morning, Purbright called on Mr. Gorse again, this time without Love. He entered the upstairs room quietly, as though he were himself a penitent. The secretary looked surprised, but not dismayed. You come again, Inspector? Have you discovered new suspicions? Purbright seated himself without invitation. I have spoken with Pilbeam. He admits carrying a Bible from the infirmary to this place at your request. Do you deny it? Gorse's face hardened. We did not steal it. We reclaimed it. Left to gather dust in a ward, its pages thumbed by the indifferent, it was profaned. Here, it is honoured. Purbright's voice remained level. The law does not admit of reclamation, only theft. If you persist, I shall have no choice but to act. But before I do, I ask you, to what end are you gathering these books? For what spectacle? The secretary's mouth twitched, a flash of zeal beneath restraint. You will see. Soon, all will see. We shall restore the word to its rightful place, not as ornament, but as judgment. Purbright held his gaze for a long moment. Then he rose, thanked Gorse for his candour, and left. He knew he could order a search, perhaps uncover the missing volumes at once. Yet something in the man's words stopped him. There was design here, unfolding step by step. To intervene too soon would be to snatch the thread without seeing where it led. Back at the station, he instructed Love, we must not frighten them yet. Instead, we shall watch. Set Constable Thoday to keep an eye on their meetings, quietly, and see whether more Bibles vanish in the coming days. I want to know if this is to culminate in some display. The days that followed bore out his caution. Within a week, reports arrived, the Bible from the council chamber, the one from the railway mission hall, and another from the school assembly room, all missing, all unaccounted for. Each theft left behind a strange vacancy, as though the absence of the book were more noticeable than its presence had ever been. Townsfolk began whispering of curses, of warnings. The Chronicle printed a headline, Sacred Texts, Stolen, Flaxborough Bewildered. Constable Thoday reported that late at night men carried parcels up the chemist's stairs, wrapped in sacking but of unmistakable shape. Through a narrow crack in the curtain, he saw them laid upon the table, then covered reverently with cloth. The fellowship grew bolder, their gatherings louder, though still confined within those dingy walls. Purbright considered the matter with tightening concern. "It is a procession in reverse," he mused to Love. "Not books borne into churches, but out of them, carried like trophies. What is the terminus of such a march? They mean to reveal them, and in a manner calculated to sting." By the second week, tension had spread through Flaxborough. The vicar preached against zealotry, the mayor grumbled about security, and shopkeepers lowered their voices when discussing the thefts. Yet the fellowship said nothing publicly. Their silence, Purbright realized, was its own kind of proclamation. At last, word reached him from a source he trusted least but valued most, a rumor drifting through the pubs. The fellowship were planning a gathering, not in their upstairs room, but in the old Corn Exchange, a hall disused for years, its lofty arches and dusty galleries waiting like a stage. They had secured it for a service of restoration. Purbright felt the word strike him with a chill. Restoration, yes, but to what, and at whose expense? He summoned Love and gave orders for discreet preparation. "We shall not forbid them yet. To silence them would only lend them martyrdom, but we shall be present. If those missing Bibles appear, I shall see them with my own eyes, and the town shall see too. See what folly has been dressed as reverence." That night, as rain lashed the streets and the lamps swayed in the wind, Purbright wrote a brief note in his careful hand. "The danger is not in the theft, but in the theatre that follows. We must be ready for both." He set down his pen and sat back, listening to the storm. Somewhere above the chemist's shop, behind closed shutters, the stolen Bibles waited, their pages silent, their weight heavy with a purpose not their own. And Inspector Purbright, who had faced vanity, greed, and folly in many forms, felt that this time he was dealing with something colder, more deliberate, the certainty of men who believed their cause beyond law. The stage was being set. Soon curtain would rise. Inspector Purbright arrived at the station earlier than usual on the morning after the storm. The night's uneasy thoughts had not dissolved with sleep, and his first act upon stepping into his office was to sift through the stack of reports that Constable Thoday had dutifully compiled. Each note confirmed what he already suspected. The fellowship's activity had grown more frequent, more purposeful. No longer were their movements confined to furtive transfers of parcels. They were rehearsing, it seemed, for some larger assembly. One report even described singing, stark, unmelodic chants filtering from the chemist's windows well past midnight. Sergeant Love entered with the tentative tread of a man who expected his superior to be already deep in thought. He carried a folded copy of the Chronicle, whose front page bore yet another headline on the missing Bibles. "They're working themselves into a lather, sir," he remarked, laying the paper on Purbright's desk. "Letters to the editor, complaints to the council, even Mrs. Teal from the lending libraries written in, asking whether she ought to lock away her hymnals in case the fellowship fancies those too." Purbright glanced at the column, then set the sheet aside with little more than a sigh. "The public will tolerate many inconveniences, Love, but once sacred property vanishes from every institution in town, they demand a culprit. Our difficulty is that the culprit is not hiding, but parading in plain sight." Love frowned. "Shall we raid them before they manage their big show?" "That," Purbright said, steepling his fingers, "would only hasten their glory. They wish for resistance, for a chance to prove themselves unjustly persecuted. If we move too soon, we gift them precisely the martyrdom they crave. No, we must let them gather their trophies and then oblige them to explain in full view of the very public they seek to sway." Love gave a reluctant nod, though his eyes betrayed worry. "If they mean harm, sir," Purbright finished the thought, "then we shall be there to prevent it." which is why we must know precisely when and how this assembly in the Corn Exchange is to take place. That knowledge came, as it often did, by way of the town's gossip. Late that afternoon, a clerk from the borough treasurer's office telephoned to say that a permit had been requested for use of the Exchange Hall under the vague heading of Religious Lecture and Devotional Service. The signature at the bottom was unmistakably Gorse's. The event was scheduled for Saturday evening, 2 nights hence. With the time fixed, Purbright began his preparations. He instructed Love to arrange for a small detachment of constables dressed in plain clothes to be scattered among the expected audience. "Do not intimidate them," he cautioned. "Appear curious, even sympathetic if you must. We are not there to prevent speech, but to witness. Only when the missing property appears, or worse, when the fellowship attempt some greater mischief, shall we intervene." Saturday came with the slow gravity of a day carrying too much weight for comfort. By dusk, the Corn Exchange loomed in shadow, its great arched windows faintly aglow with the light of lamps hastily strung along the galleries. Citizens of Flaxborough drifted toward the building in clusters, drawn by equal measures of curiosity and unease. Some came to scoff, others to listen, and more than a few because it was said, one ought never to miss a spectacle in so small a town. Purbright and Love positioned themselves near the back, blending into the crowd. The constables, scattered as instructed, took their seats quietly. A smell of damp stone mingled with dust stirred up as benches scraped across the wooden floor. Above the murmurs of the gathering, the sound of an organ wheezed uncertainly. Someone had dragged it out of retirement for the occasion. Then, at precisely 8 o'clock, the fellowship appeared. Gorse led the procession, followed by half a dozen men carrying long wooden boxes. The crowd fell into a hush as these were borne to the front and set upon trestles beneath the arch of the dais. With solemn gestures, the men lifted each lid and withdrew its contents. One by one, the missing Bibles emerged. Some were bound in plain cloth, others in cracked leather. Each was laid carefully upon the table, arranged in rows like specimens or, more disturbingly, like relics upon an altar. Murmurs rippled through the audience as townsfolk recognized volumes they had once seen in the hospital ward, the school hall, the railway mission. Gorse stepped forward, his face illuminated by the crude lamps. He raised his hand for silence, and the hall obeyed. "Citizens of Flaxborough," he began, his voice thin but urgent, "we gather tonight not to profane but to restore. These books, neglected, defiled by careless hands, abandoned in places unworthy, have been rescued. Here, in the fellowship of true devotion, they shall be honored, and with them the Word itself shall be reborn." The words struck with theatrical cadence, though the effect upon the crowd was mixed. Some listened raptly, heads bowed as though caught in the spell of his certainty. Others shifted uneasily, muttering that the man was a thief dressed as a prophet. Purbright observed closely, every detail feeding into the calculus of his judgment. He saw how the arrangement of the books, spread like trophies, lent weight to Gorse's claim of reclamation. He noted, too, how the man's eyes darted between the audience and the dais as though measuring his hold upon them. The speech gathered force. Gorse denounced the institutions of Flaxborough, the council, the schools, the churches, themselves, for failing in reverence, for reducing Scripture to ornament and leaving truth to wither. "But we," he cried, "we shall not permit it. We shall carry these words into every heart, and we shall begin here, tonight." At this, the fellowship members opened several of the Bibles and began to read aloud, voices overlapping in a discordant chorus. The sound rose and clashed in the vaulted hall, less a hymn than a torrent. Some in the crowd covered their ears, others pressed forward, caught by the spectacle. Love leaned toward Purbright, whispering, "Do we act, sir?" Theft plain as day. "Not yet," Purbright murmured, his gaze fixed upon the dais. "Wait until the tide turns. Let them overreach." And overreach they did. For after the reading, Gorse raised his arms again and declared, "These books shall not return to their prisons. Tonight we sanctify them anew. Tomorrow we march with them through every street of Flaxborough, a procession of truth to shame the faithless." A stir of alarm swept through the hall. The prospect of zealots parading stolen Bibles through the town was too much for many present. Voices rose in protest, some demanding the return of property, others decrying the blasphemy of spectacle. What had begun as curiosity now tipped toward unrest. It was at this precise moment that Purbright gave the slightest nod to Love. The sergeant stood, and in a firm voice that carried over the tumult, said, "Mr. Gorse, on behalf of the borough police, I must inform you that these books are evidence of theft. You and your associates are required to accompany us for questioning." The declaration struck like a bell. The fellowship members stiffened, some clutching at the volumes as though to shield them. Gorse's eyes blazed with defiance. "You would silence truth? You would chain the word?" Purbright stepped forward at last, his calm presence a counterweight to the chaos. "No, Mr. Gorse. We would only restore property to those who entrusted it to public care. You may preach what you like, but not with what is stolen." The hall erupted, some in applause, others in jeers. Constables moved swiftly, placing themselves between the fellowship and the crowd. In the confusion, two men attempted to spirit away a bundle of books, but were stopped at the door. Purbright, standing amid the commotion, felt a grim satisfaction. The moment had come, and the fellowship's theatre had collapsed under its own ambition. Yet he knew this was only an act, not the play entire. For in Gorse's burning eyes, even as he was led away, there was no hint of defeat, only the promise of another attempt, another stage upon which his cause might be proclaimed. And so as the corn exchange emptied into the night, Purbright resolved that the matter was far from finished. Flaxborough had seen the fellowship's spectacle and rejected it, but zeal was not so easily extinguished. The Bibles would be returned, the arrests made, yet the deeper question remained: what had driven ordinary men to such a cause, and what further mischief might they pursue when next they gathered in secret? The inspector knew his task had entered a new, more delicate phase. The battle was not merely for property, but for the temper of the town itself. And for that, patience and vigilance would be his only weapons. The steady drizzle that had pursued Flaxborough through most of the afternoon finally exhausted itself by evening, leaving the pavement slick and shining under the pale glow of the street lamps. In the police station, Inspector Purbright sat at his desk, a thin coil of smoke from his pipe drifting towards the ceiling. Before him lay a tidy stack of statements and notes, each one containing its own version of truth, suspicion, or self-preserving omission. None, so far, quite touched upon the simple and direct matter of how a Bible, destined for such solemn prominence in a court of law, had vanished without a trace. Sergeant Love entered with his usual blend of nervous importance and dutiful cheer, carrying 2 mugs of tea and a notebook that appeared on the verge of collapse under the strain of paper stuffed into it. "Evening, sir. Thought you might take another look at these." He laid the mugs carefully on the desk and spread out a handful of scribbled sheets. Witness lists from Mr. Carradine's office, names of all who had access to the evidence cupboard. Purbright regarded them with mild appreciation, though he did not immediately reach for them. "I imagine," he said, with measured calm, that Mr. Carradine took rather a broad view of the word access. Love nodded with eager gravity. "That's right, sir. Practically half the town, if you ask me. Clerks, cleaners, visiting solicitors, the odd council official. And, well—" He hesitated. "There's even a note about a certain Mrs. Stillingfleet. Says here she dropped by on, let's see, Wednesday afternoon. Something about mislaid deeds. Wouldn't have been in the cupboard at the time, of course, but she might well have observed the arrangement of things, or the lack of arrangement." Purbright exhaled a thoughtful stream of smoke. "I wonder whether she noticed more than she claimed." Love gave a little laugh, uncertain whether to interpret this as humour or direction. "I could ask her, sir." "Not yet." Purbright leaned back. "Better to let Mrs. Stillingfleet recall in her own good time. Direct inquiry at this point might merely supply her with an opportunity for invention." The sergeant subsided into a chair, balancing his mug on his knee, and looked hopefully at his superior. "Then what's our next move?" Purbright tapped the stem of his pipe against the desk. "Our next move, love, is to consider why anyone would want a Bible at all. Bibles, in my experience, are not especially difficult to obtain." "Unless they wanted that particular one, sir." "Precisely." Purbright gave him a mild smile. "You have touched the matter neatly." It was left at that, but Love felt a private glow of satisfaction. He had begun, over the years, to recognize when the inspector's compliments, though spare and understated, were genuine enough. The following morning brought fresh developments, though of the kind Purbright had almost expected. Miss Teatime appeared, at once apologetic and bristling with authority, to inform him that certain rumours had reached her attention. These rumours concerned the possibility that the missing Bible had been spirited away not for legal sabotage, but for reasons of personal morality. "There are those, Inspector," she said, smoothing the already immaculate fabric of her gloves, "who believe the book may have contained marginalia, unfortunate marginalia, notes and annotations, you see, in a hand known to belong to someone of public standing. I shan't name names, though naturally one hears whispers." Purbright's expression conveyed only the faintest interest, but he inclined his head politely. "And the whispers, Miss Teatime? Did they suggest whose hand might be involved?" Her lips curved into something between a smirk and a seal of confidentiality. "A certain gentleman who enjoys declaiming from pulpits on Sundays and arranging parish fêtes the rest of the week. I dare say you can guess." "I would prefer not to," Purbright murmured, "until I have something sturdier than guesswork to stand upon." Miss Teatime allowed herself a sigh, the kind one reserves for those who refuse to be properly scandalized. "Very well, Inspector, but do not say later that I failed to prepare the ground." She left, clicking away in her polished shoes, and Love, who had been lurking discreetly by the door, gave Purbright an expectant look. "Do you suppose she's right, sir? That the vicar, or whoever, scribbled something compromising in the margins?" "Not impossible," said Purbright. "But equally possible is that Miss Teatime, like many of her generation, has grown rather addicted to the idea that scandal hides behind every hymnal." He rose and reached for his coat. Still, a visit to the vestry may not be wasted, if only to satisfy ourselves that no sermon notes have been liberated from their proper home. At St. Swithin's, the Reverend Cribbins received them with his customary blend of geniality and faint alarm. His study smelled of polish, dust, and faintly of damp cassock. "The missing Bible?" he exclaimed, pushing his spectacles higher. "Oh, dear me! Yes, I have heard." "Terrible business, terrible. Not the holy word itself, of course, that cannot be lost, praise be, but still. Most irregular, very bad for confidence in the institutions of justice." Purbright inclined his head. Quite so. Tell me, Reverend, would you happen to know of anyone in your congregation, or beyond it, who might have had reason to feel concerned about private annotations in such a volume? The colour drained slightly from the vicar's face, and his spectacles fogged. Annotations? My dear Inspector, I do hope you're not suggesting anything indecorous. The Bible is sacred. Purbright did not contradict him, but allowed a silence to lengthen just enough for discomfort. Reverend Cribbins fiddled with a hymnal. Of course, he stammered, I do occasionally, mark certain passages for sermon reference, but nothing improper, I assure you. Notes about cross-references, the odd Greek term, you understand. Love, who was attempting to look respectfully clerical, ventured, You haven't lost one of yours lately, sir? Cribbins flapped a hand in dismissal. Oh, good heavens, no, mine are all here. Safely locked in the vestry cabinet. In fact, he hesitated, then brightened with sudden eagerness. In fact, you must see for yourself. The vestry, though tidy, bore the tell-tale traces of hurried order. The cabinet, when opened, displayed an array of Bibles, hymnals, and registers, all lined with a suspicious neatness. Purbright's gaze lingered not on the texts, but on the lock itself, a newer model, the brass still gleaming. You had this replaced recently? He asked mildly. Yes, Cribbins said. Only last week. The old lock was sticking dreadfully. Couldn't have that with weddings and christenings, you know. People do like to feel that registers are properly secure. Purbright murmured polite agreement, but as they left the church, Love's curiosity could no longer be restrained. Do you think it's connected, sir? The lock, the cupboard, all that? Purbright allowed a faint smile. I think, love, that when new locks appear in old places, they seldom do so without someone having been inconvenienced first. Back at the station, a message awaited them. The clerk from Carradine's office, nervous, pale and plainly desperate to be helpful, reported that on the morning before the Bible vanished, he had discovered the evidence cupboard's door standing ajar. He had closed it without remark, assuming someone else had simply been careless. That, said Purbright, was probably the most accurate assumption he could have made. Yet it is only now that it becomes useful. Love frowned. Because it means someone had already been poking about? Indeed, Purbright replied. And it tells us one thing more. Whoever removed the Bible did not require to force the lock. They had the means to open it, either legitimately or by prior preparation. The sergeant blinked. So we're looking for someone who had a key? Purbright shook his head gently. Not quite. We are looking for someone who ought to have had a key, or who contrived to behave as though they did. The inspector's voice carried no particular emphasis, but Love felt the familiar tingle that came when they were edging close to something important. For all the orderly calm of Purbright's manner, there was now the faintest glimmer of pursuit in his eyes, a sign that though the town might still treat the matter as little more than fodder for gossip, the truth was stirring beneath the surface, patient and waiting to be uncovered. The evening shadows were already stretching across Flaxborough when Inspector Purbright returned to his office. It had been a day of visits and polite evasions, each encounter offering a little colour but no picture. He had heard contradictions enough to fill several notebooks, yet the one matter that kept rising above the rest was the Bible's sudden disappearance. Its absence was being explained with such zeal by so many that one could hardly help suspecting that at least some of them had more interest in its vanishing than in its presence. The inspector sat at his desk with a mild expression of contentment, which Sergeant Love had long ago learned was deceptive. To an onlooker, it might suggest the man had either found an answer or ceased caring for one. In reality, it meant that Purbright was arranging the puzzle in his mind, shifting bits about until the shape began to show itself. He had not yet settled on the edges, but he had certainly noticed that the colours of certain pieces, Mrs. Arbuthnot's determined account of having seen the Bible last in the vestry, the curate's hesitant correction of her recollection, and Mrs. Winstanley's improbable certainty about its being placed in a locked cupboard, did not quite match. Love came in carrying his usual stack of papers, which contained notes of interviews he had diligently and sometimes unintentionally comically obtained. He laid them down as if expecting the inspector to pounce upon them immediately. When Purbright did no such thing, Love, after a few seconds, cleared his throat. "Sir," he began cautiously, "I don't know if it helps, but I asked the caretaker at the courthouse what happened to the other books they keep about for the oath-taking. He says they were never touched, just this one. Odd, that." "Odd, yes," Purbright murmured. "Though odd in Flaxborough is rather like wet in the North Sea. One grows used to it." Love waited, unsure whether to laugh. He opted to cough instead. "He also said," he continued, "that one of the jurors, chap named Briggs, had been asking about the Bible before the trial even started. Something about whether the same book had to be used for all witnesses. Did he now?" Purbright's mild tone sharpened just slightly, like a paper cutting one's finger. "Mr. Briggs, if I recall, runs a small garage near the station, a tidy enterprise by all accounts. He is also, unless I misremember, brother-in-law to Mrs. Winstanley's second cousin, a connection of little consequence, of course." Love nodded, though he clearly could not decide whether it was little consequence or not. Purbright leaned back. "There is a certain peculiarity here, Love. Not so much that the Bible is missing. After all, one can mislay an umbrella with less trouble. It is the eagerness with which various good citizens have hurried to explain the matter. That tends to suggest a consciousness of interest, as if each would like to fix the narrative while it is still malleable." The sergeant furrowed his brow. "Meaning, sir, that the more they talk, the more likely one of them's got something to hide." "A working hypothesis," Purbright agreed. "Though concealment is not always of crime. Sometimes it is merely of folly." Later that night, at the Crown and Cushion, the matter was already developing into one of those conversational storms for which Flaxborough was famed. The Bible, which had seemed a mere prop in the routine of justice, now held a glamour out of all proportion to its physical size. To some, its loss indicated a conspiracy to pervert justice. To others, a prank of such audacity that only the younger generation could be blamed. And to at least one, Mr. Pallis, a retired draper, it was proof that the town was being infiltrated by foreign agents. Mrs. Arbuthnot, who sat with her customary air of preferring the role of oracle to that of gossip, declared in measured tones that the Bible had been stolen by someone with a religious mania. The precise nature of this mania she did not elucidate, though she hinted that it was probably of continental origin. At another table, Briggs himself, a heavy man with a slow, damp manner of speech, was telling anyone who would listen that the whole affair was being blown out of proportion. "Book's a book," he muttered. "Plenty more where that come from. Don't see why the police are fussing." His insistence that the matter was trifling carried an air of protest too rehearsed, and it did not escape Purbright, who happened to be taking his coffee in a corner of the room. The inspector, while never one to rush towards an accusation, had cultivated the habit of listening to tones rather than words. Briggs's tone was a little too fastidious in its carelessness, as though he were eager to drop the subject before it was properly lifted. The following morning, Purbright arranged for a call at Briggs's garage. He did so under the pretext of inquiring about a police van that had been reluctant to start in damp weather. Briggs received him with the gloomy courtesy of a man resigned to talking about machines with people who had no right to them. The conversation drifted, as Purbright meant it should, towards the events at the courthouse. Briggs laughed too briefly when the inspector mentioned the vanished Bible. "Bound to turn up," he said, and changed the subject to the unreliability of carburettors. But Purbright noted the abruptness, the way the man's eyes flickered towards the workshop door, as if checking no one else were listening. "Quite so," Purbright agreed mildly. "Bibles are like old account books. They have a habit of resurfacing in cupboards one would have sworn empty. Still, it would be awkward for the court should it not reappear. You see, there are certain people in Flaxborough who will inevitably assume its disappearance signifies something sinister." Briggs muttered, "Town's full of cranks," then excused himself on the pretext of dealing with a customer. On the inspector's walk back, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. What puzzled him most was not Briggs's nervousness, nor Mrs. Winstanley's contradictory recollections, nor even the curate's flustered correction. It was the curious air of preparation in all of them, as though each had been rehearsing a little speech for the very moment the police inquired. That suggested some foreknowledge. And foreknowledge, in matters of crime or folly, was always of more interest to him than motive. That evening, Love returned with a note. "Sir, I've got something. One of the courthouse clerks says he saw a woman, small, carrying a basket, near the vestry door just before the trial began. He thought nothing of it at the time. But when he heard the Bible was missing, he wondered." Purbright looked at the note, then at Love. "A woman with a basket, Love. In Flaxborough. That narrows the field, I should say, to about 2/3 of the adult female population. Still, it is a lead." Love grinned sheepishly. The inspector tucked the note into his pocket and gazed out of the window at the town's lamplight. He did not say it aloud, but he was beginning to suspect that the Bible's vanishing was not, as many assumed, the beginning of a story. It was the continuation of one whose opening chapters had been written some time ago, in quiet corners, by hands that thought themselves unnoticed. Inspector Purbright did not immediately pursue the report of the woman with the basket. His instinct, sharpened through years of watching Flaxborough's inhabitants embroider their ordinary lives with curious little contrivances, advised patience. Such fragments of testimony were prone to expand into elaborate fancies if chased too eagerly. Instead, he spent the next morning quietly moving through the courthouse itself, speaking in that mild, courteous tone which always seemed to produce more confidences than the bluster of officialdom could achieve. The vestry where the Bible was last supposed to have been seen was a narrow room smelling faintly of polish and damp paper. A cupboard with a swollen door stood against one wall. Beneath its uneven shelves were stacked surplus hymnals and a few moth-nibbled surplices. Purbright examined it without touching anything, his eyes lingering on the scratched keyhole. The caretaker assured him the lock was seldom used and that half the town had access to the key. "Which half?" Purbright asked gently. The caretaker scratched his head. "Oh, just about anyone who's been trusted with it over the years. Clergy, clerks, choir ladies. There's another key somewhere, though I've not seen it lately." The inspector smiled faintly, thanked the man, and left. He had noted a faint impression in the dust on one of the shelves, rectangular, just large enough to have accommodated a heavy book, a Bible, for instance. As he descended the courthouse steps, Purbright met Miss Teatime, whose appearance in any scene of intrigue was as inevitable as the chime of the parish clock. She was brisk, trim, and attired in her usual dark coat, which gave her the air of a retired governess who had never truly retired. She greeted him with bright civility, and after a pause remarked, "I understand you are searching for a missing volume, Inspector?" A curious business. One cannot help wondering whether it is the word of God or merely the words of men that someone wished to suppress. Purbright inclined his head. Your interest is always gratifying, Miss Teatime. May I ask where you gleaned this intelligence? From precisely the same place you will hear it before the day is out, from the mouths of half a dozen shop assistants who happen to overhear their customers. Flaxborough is not noted for discretion. He allowed himself a smile. Nor for indifference. Miss Teatime's eyes gleamed. True, though some forms of indifference are harder to achieve than others. For example, I could not help noticing Mr. Briggs yesterday evening attempting to drown his conversation in beer. A man too eager to be casual, I thought. Purbright regarded her steadily. She had once provided him with information of startling accuracy, though he never quite knew whether it was by accident or design. And what conclusion did you draw from his eagerness? That he knows who has the book, she replied at once, and is rather afraid of being the one blamed for its loss. She left him with that neat suggestion, walking off with the air of one who had given a gift and was content to let the recipient discover its value in due course. Later that day, Sergeant Love returned from another errand with a scrap of information. Sir, he began, I spoke with the clerk again, the one who saw the woman with the basket. He now says he recognized her, thinks it was Mrs. Peebles, the laundress. She does a lot of fetching and carrying for the choir ladies. Did he now? Purbright leaned back in his chair. And did Mrs. Peebles herself admit to such an errand? Love shook his head. I've not had the chance to ask her yet, but she's not the sort to get mixed up in anything shady, sir. Always cheerful, never misses chapel. That alone, Purbright murmured, makes her remarkable in Flaxborough. When, an hour later, Mrs. Peebles was shown into his office, she proved to be a small, bustling woman with bright eyes and a mouth accustomed to both laughter and complaint. She listened to the inspector's inquiry with frank indignation. Me? Take the Bible? Well, of all the nonsense, I did go to the vestry that morning, yes, but only to leave a parcel of clean surplices. Basket was full to the brim and heavy enough without lugging a great book about. I never so much as touched it. Purbright nodded slowly. Yet someone may have seen you and assumed otherwise. They can assume what they like, she retorted. I've never stolen so much as a hairpin. And as for that book, well, I did notice it wasn't in its usual place when I looked about for somewhere to set the basket down. I remember thinking it odd, but I thought nothing more of it. That remark, so naturally given, carried more weight in Purbright's mind than all the elaborate declarations of innocence he had endured from others. He thanked her courteously, let her go, and sat for a moment in thought. If the Bible was missing before Mrs. Peebles set down her basket, then its removal had occurred earlier than he had been led to believe. That pushed suspicion back to a narrower window. Likely before the trial began, perhaps during the early bustle, when few eyes paid attention to what moved in and out of rooms, evening fell again, and Flaxborough's streets grew quiet, save for the occasional echo of boots on pavement and the murmur of voices from public houses. Purbright, however, did not take his ease. He was walking slowly along the high street, his thoughts circling. The missing Bible was no priceless relic. Its value lay in symbolism, in the ceremonial gravity it lent to testimony. To steal it, then, was not the act of a thief seeking profit. It was, he felt increasingly sure, either an attempt to disrupt proceedings or to conceal something already connected with those proceedings. When he returned to his office, he found Love waiting with another note. Sir, I've just had word from one of the junior clerks. He says he overheard Mr. Briggs in the yard this morning, arguing with Mrs. Winstanley. Couldn't catch much, but he did hear her say, "Oh, you shouldn't have meddled with it at all." Then they both noticed him and stopped talking. Purbright read the note in silence. Then he placed it carefully on the desk, folded his hands and regarded his sergeant. "Love, I think we are edging towards the heart of this. It may be that the Bible itself is not the object but the vessel. What was placed inside it or what was concealed by it that may be our real quarry." The sergeant's eyes widened. "Inside it, sir? You mean something hidden between the pages?" "It is an old device," Purbright said mildly, "but an effective one, and one which would explain why certain people are at pains to suggest where the book was or was not. The danger is not in the word, but in the words that may have been tucked away among them." Love looked both alarmed and impressed. "Then we'll have to find it quick, sir, before whoever's got it thinks to destroy it." Purbright rose, smoothing his coat. "Indeed. But we must also be careful. Too sudden a move, and we shall send our quarry scurrying into shadows we cannot follow. Better to let them believe they are still a step ahead, until, quite without noticing, they find themselves a step behind." That night, as the inspector prepared to leave for home, he paused at the window overlooking the darkened square. The lamps glowed faintly on cobbles, slick with drizzle. Somewhere out there, someone was holding a Bible not for prayer, but for secrecy. The town's chatter, its eagerness to embroider the tale, might soon weave itself into a noose. And Purbright, with his patient, quiet watchfulness, intended to see exactly who placed their head within it. The following morning found Inspector Purbright at his desk earlier than usual, the light outside still more grey than gold, and the streets beneath his office window muffled with damp mist. He was not a man who habitually drove himself to long hours, but this case, with its small and elusive details, demanded the sort of steady, deliberate pressure that eventually produced cracks in even the most stubborn wall of secrecy. He had slept little, his mind circling the thought of the Bible not as sacred text, but as container. If something were concealed within it, then its disappearance had not merely symbolic mischief behind it, but urgent practicality. Sergeant Love arrived, bleary-eyed, and carrying a paper bag from which protruded the crust of a sausage roll. He looked apologetic. "Mrs. packed me too," he explained, setting the bag down. "Thought you might fancy one, sir." Purbright accepted it with a faint smile, and together they ate in companionable silence, the inspector's thoughts still elsewhere. At length he put his food aside and leaned forward. "Love, I want you to fetch Briggs here this morning. Nothing too formal, simply invite him to discuss his duties during the trial. He needn't suspect more than that." Love nodded, wiping crumbs from his sleeve. "And Mrs. Winstanley, sir?" "Not yet. We will tread gently. There is more to be gained from letting her believe her words to Briggs went unheard." By mid-morning, Briggs was shown into the office. He looked harassed, his collar too tight and his fingers continually twitching at his cuff. Purbright welcomed him with courteous gravity and asked a few ordinary questions about the smooth running of the courthouse during sessions. Briggs answered readily enough at first, but the inspector's measured gaze seemed to unnerve him. "There was some confusion, of course," Briggs said at last, dabbing at his temple. "The vestry door sticking, papers mislaid, the usual little muddles. Nothing unusual, Inspector, nothing whatever." Purbright tilted his head. "So you would not call it unusual if a Bible, placed there as part of the day's formalities, were to vanish?" The man's colour deepened. Well, I had nothing to do with that, I assure you. I never even touched it. That was all—" He broke off suddenly. "All whose doing, Mr. Briggs?" "No one's," Briggs said, quickly. "I meant nothing by it." Purbright regarded him in silence, letting the discomfort lengthen until the clerk shifted in his chair. Then, in his mildest tone, he said, "I believe you may be trying rather too hard to avoid naming someone. That often leads one into deeper suspicion than speaking plainly. Do you see?" Briggs licked his lips. Look, Inspector, Mrs. Winstanley, she asked me to make sure the vestry was kept locked for a while that morning. Said she was tidying the place and didn't want people tramping in and out. I thought nothing of it at the time. But now, well, I suppose it might have given her a chance. To do what? Briggs spread his hands helplessly. I don't know. Move the book, perhaps, but if she did, it wasn't on my orders. I only did as she asked. Dismissed a little later, Briggs left with obvious relief, though his hasty retreat did nothing to lessen Purbright's conviction that he was holding something back. The inspector sat for a time, turning the matter over. Mrs. Winstanley's name had now been brought forward by two sources, one overheard, the other reluctantly admitted. That convergence could not be ignored. "Love," Purbright said quietly, "we must visit Mrs. Winstanley this afternoon. I think it time we heard her version of these events." The sergeant looked pleased at the prospect of straightforward inquiry. "Shall I bring the car round, sir?" "No, not yet. Let us walk. A little unexpectedness in our manner may yield more than a show of force." It was near to 2 o'clock when the pair set out through the narrow streets toward the row of modest houses where Mrs. Winstanley lived. The mist had thinned but left the air raw, and the inspector walked with hands clasped behind his back, his pace unhurried. When they arrived, Mrs. Winstanley herself opened the door. She was a woman of middle years, stout of figure and sharp of eye, with an apron still tied about her waist. She looked startled to see them, but quickly composed herself. "Inspector, Sergeant, what an unexpected pleasure. Do come in. The kitchen's warm, though I can't promise much in the way of refreshment. I've only just put the kettle on." They accepted her invitation and were soon seated at a scrubbed wooden table, the smell of strong tea filling the little room. Purbright waited until mugs were set before them before speaking. "Mrs. Winstanley," he began gently, "we are trying to resolve the matter of the missing Bible from the courthouse vestry. Your name has been mentioned more than once, and I would very much value your account." Her eyes narrowed a fraction, though her smile remained. "My name, Inspector? Why, ever so. I've not been near that book. My duties are quite apart from such things." "Yet you asked Mr. Briggs to keep the vestry locked that morning. You must have had a reason?" For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed her face. She busied herself with the teapot before replying, "Oh, that? Yes, I did ask him, but only because I'd left some personal belongings in there earlier, my shawl and a box of sewing. I didn't want anyone rummaging about. That's all there was to it." Purbright sipped his tea slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "And when you returned for these belongings, was the Bible still in its place?" She hesitated. "I didn't notice. Truly, I had no reason to look." The inspector set down his cup. "Mrs. Winstanley, may I put this to you plainly? The removal of that Bible was not a trifling prank. It may conceal within its pages something of consequence, papers, perhaps, or notes which were not meant to come to light. If you know anything of this, now would be the moment to speak of it. Silence may serve another's purpose, but not your own." Her cheeks flushed. "Inspector, I won't be made a scapegoat. Yes, I kept the vestry closed, but I never touched the book. If anyone meddled with it, it was before I came back for my things. That is the truth." There was a force to her denial that persuaded Purbright she was, if not entirely candid, at least not the principal actor. He let the matter rest and thanked her for her time. As they walked away, Love murmured, "What do you make of that, sir?" Purbright's expression was thoughtful. "I make of it that Mrs. Winstanley knows more than she will admit, but perhaps only by accident. Someone used her request for privacy as a shield. The question is, who was ready to take advantage of it?" That evening, back at the station, a constable brought in a fresh report. A bookseller in the High Street had been approached 2 days earlier by a nervous-looking man who asked whether a large Bible could be rebound discreetly. The bookseller, sensing peculiarity, had declined, but he remembered the man well enough, tall, spare, with a grey moustache. The description was a fair likeness of Mr. Hargreaves, one of the older clerks attached to the court. Purbright felt the pulse of progress quicken. A second clerk implicated, and one old enough to have mastered discretion. He sat back, steepling his fingers. "Love," he said, "tomorrow we shall have a quiet word with Mr. Hargreaves, but not in the station. A man of his age and dignity may prove more candid in surroundings less formal. Perhaps the library will do." The sergeant nodded, eyes bright with anticipation. The net, so patiently woven, was beginning to draw close. Yet Purbright knew the real question still remained. What lay between those vanished pages that justified such risk? Until that was answered, the Bible was no mere missing volume, but the silent center of a tightening coil of secrets. The library, with its quiet lanes of shelves and soft odor of bindings both ancient and recent, seemed to Inspector Purbright an apt setting for the next conversation. He had chosen it deliberately, knowing that Mr. Hargreaves, an orderly, somewhat austere, clerk of late middle age, was more likely to speak without evasion if surrounded by the silent reminders of order and continuity that books provided. The arrangement was made without fanfare, a brief note left in Hargreaves's pigeonhole, politely requesting his company that afternoon to discuss certain administrative details. When the man arrived, he looked almost relieved to find himself in the library rather than at the police station. He was tall, his shoulders bent slightly forward as if from years of leaning over ledgers, and his grey moustache twitched with each measured breath. Purbright greeted him with warmth and steered him to a table set a little apart from the reading desks, where Sergeant Love already sat, with pencil poised as if prepared to jot a memorandum. The inspector began without preamble. "Mr. Hargreaves, a matter has been troubling us. A certain Bible, usually kept in the courthouse vestry, has gone missing. I believe you know something of its fate." The moustache quivered more rapidly. "Inspector, you credit me with too much. I have no authority over the vestry property. My duties are confined to the filing of documents." "Indeed. And yet a bookseller in the High Street reports that a gentleman, matching your description, approached him 2 days ago with a request to have a Bible rebound discreetly. That is not the errand of a mere document filer, Mr. Hargreaves." The clerk's hands tightened upon the table's edge. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then said in a voice little louder than the turning of a page, "I did make such an inquiry, but not for myself, Inspector, for another." "Whom?" Purbright's tone remained courteous, but there was steel beneath. Hargreaves's eyes dropped. "I was asked to do so by Mr. Fenton, the solicitor engaged in last week's proceedings. He approached me privately, saying he wished to preserve certain papers within a volume, but feared the court might question his purpose. He offered me a modest sum to make the enquiry. I saw no harm in it. I did not think the matter urgent, nor did I expect the bookseller to recall me so clearly." Love leaned forward. "Did Mr. Fenton give you the Bible itself?" "No, Sergeant. He only asked if I could find a craftsman who would undertake the rebinding without asking questions. I told him I would inquire. That was all." Purbright allowed silence to hover. He knew the weight of it could press more than questions. At last, Hargreaves added, almost plaintively, "I did not wish to become embroiled. My position is humble, but I have served with integrity these 30 years. The inspector nodded slowly. "I do not doubt your service, Mr. Hargreaves, but the fact remains Mr. Fenton is now drawn into our circle of interest. It is curious that a solicitor whose stock in trade is documents should fear to let ordinary papers be seen. What manner of papers would require concealment in a holy book?" The clerk shook his head. "I cannot say, sir. I swear it." Satisfied he would gain no more, Purbright dismissed him with a grave word of caution and watched the man retreat between the shelves, shoulders stooped lower than ever. When the door had closed, Love breathed out. "So it's Fenton, sir. That settles it." "Nothing settles, Love," Purbright replied. "But it suggests." He rose and adjusted his coat. "We must visit this solicitor, yet we must do so carefully. If he has indeed meddled with evidence, he will be prepared with a lawyer's armour of words. A frontal assault would only drive him to silence." They arranged the interview for the following day, choosing again a neutral ground. The solicitor's own office, a gloomy chamber that smelled of stale ink, and the faint acridity of sealing wax. Fenton received them with outward politeness, though his manner was taut. He was a wiry man, clean-shaven, with eyes that darted like minnows beneath brows too heavy for his narrow face. "I suppose this concerns the Bible," he said at once, before Purbright had spoken. The inspector inclined his head. "It does. You are remarkably candid, Mr. Fenton. That spares us some preamble." The solicitor gave a brittle laugh. "Candid because I know what you've heard. Hargreaves is not built for secrecy. Yes, I asked him to make an inquiry, and yes, it involved a Bible, but you must understand it was for a client's protection, not for any deception of the court." "Which client?" Fenton hesitated. "I cannot disclose that. Professional privilege, Inspector. I'm sure you appreciate the sanctity of such an obligation." Purbright's eyes softened, though his words were exact. "Professional privilege does not extend to criminal concealment. If material evidence was hidden within that book, the court and the law must know. To deny us is not duty, Mr. Fenton. It is obstruction." The solicitor's mouth worked in silent protest before he said more quietly, "The papers were never mine. They were entrusted to me by a client who feared ruin if they came to light. I meant only to safeguard them discreetly. The Bible was merely a hiding place of convenience, chosen because it would not be suspected. I thought perhaps to have the volume rebound so the papers might rest within, harmless and unseen." "Where is it now?" "I do not know." Fenton spread his hands. "The Bible was taken before I could recover it. That much I swear. Someone else has it. And whoever that is, Inspector, they will not part with it easily." Purbright studied the man in silence. There was truth in his desperation, though shaded by the self-interest of a man who lived by manipulation. "Very well," he said at length. "You will not be charged yet, but you will remain at our disposal. Should you think of some detail you have thus far withheld, I urge you to remember that candor shown early is preferable to confession compelled later." They left him sweating behind his desk, and once outside, Love muttered, "If he doesn't know where it is, sir, then who does?" "We're back where we started." Purbright's gaze was fixed ahead. "Not quite. We know what was intended for that Bible. Papers, something damning enough that a solicitor risked disgrace to conceal them. That knowledge alters the shape of the game." That evening in his office, the inspector sat long after most of the station had emptied, his lamp burning low. He reconstructed the sequence, the Bible placed in the vestry, Fenton planning to secrete papers within it, Hargreaves enlisted as an unwitting agent, Mrs. Winstanley providing unwitting cover for a theft she did not see. Then, the volume gone, spirited away before Fenton could execute his design. Someone with sharper eyes and quicker hand had anticipated him. Who had the access, the motive, the presence of mind? Briggs, too frightened. Hargreaves, too timid. Mrs. Winstanley, too defensive, yet not calculating. That left only an unknown hand, one who knew precisely what that Bible contained, or would soon contain. A knock at the door roused him. Love entered, cap in hand, with a slip of paper. "Message just in, sir, from the post office. Seems a parcel was intercepted this evening, addressed to a London solicitor. Inside was found a sheaf of papers, torn, hurriedly stuffed in. No Bible, but the papers were wrapped in vellum covers." Purbright took the slip, his eyes sharpening. "And the sender?" "No name, sir, but the parcel was posted here, in town, not an hour before it was stopped." The inspector leaned back, the faintest glimmer of satisfaction touching his usually grave features. At last, the Bible had yielded its secret, though not in the way its thief intended. The papers had begun their journey toward the daylight of scrutiny. What they contained, and whose ruin they threatened, would soon be known. For the first time in days, Purbright allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The circle was closing, and with it, the truth.